The drill bit hit something solid at exactly 11 feet below the surface. The sound was wrong, not the grinding resistance of rock, but the hollow clang of metal on metal. Carlos Herrera, operating the well drilling rig on the Thompson Ranch in rural New Mexico, immediately shut down the machinery. It was April 2024, and the Thompson family needed a new water well for their cattle operation. They'd chosen this spot on the eastern edge of their 4,000-acre property specifically because geological surveys suggested good groundwater. Nobody expected to find anything except rock and sediment. When Carlos and ranch owner Tom Thompson excavated around the drill point, their shovels revealed something impossible. Paint. Black automotive paint. At 11 feet underground, in the middle of nowhere, 60 miles southeast of Albuquerque, someone had buried a car. Not just any car. When they'd cleared enough soil away to see the distinctive chrome grille and long hood, Tom Thompson felt his blood run cold. He'd grown up hearing the legend. Every old-timer in this part of New Mexico knew the story of Dr. David Miller and his black Lincoln Continental that vanished without a trace in the summer of 1961. Before we dive deeper into this haunting mystery, if you're new to this channel, please hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We bring you the most compelling true crime cases with the depth and respect they deserve. Today's story will show you how sometimes the desert keeps its secrets for over 6 decades, and how one random drill hole can finally bring answers, though not all of them, to a family that never stopped wondering. By the end of this video, you'll understand how a respected physician disappeared on an ordinary evening, how an entire community searched for answers that were literally buried beneath their feet, and why even modern forensics can't give us absolute certainty about what happened on August 23, 1961. Dr. David Andrew Miller was born in Chicago, Illinois in 1923, but the Southwest had claimed his heart long before he vanished into it. He was the second of 3 children born to working-class parents during the lean years of the Great Depression. Despite financial hardships, David excelled academically. His teachers recognized something special, a quick mind paired with genuine compassion for others. He earned a full scholarship to Northwestern University in 1941, intending to study engineering. But when the United States entered World War II after Pearl Harbor, David enlisted in the Army Medical Corps at age 19. He served as a medic in Europe, seeing combat in France and Germany. The experience changed him. He returned home in 1946, determined to become a doctor. Using the GI Bill, David attended medical school at the University of Illinois, graduating in 1950 at age 27. During his residency in internal medicine, he met Helen Richardson, a surgical nurse, 5 years his junior. Their courtship was brief but intense. They married in April 1949, eager to start their life together. Their first child, Thomas, was born in December 1949, just 8 months after the wedding. Their daughter, Margaret, arrived in 1952. By 1961, Dr. David Miller had become one of Albuquerque's most respected physicians. He stood 6 feet tall, with prematurely graying hair that had turned silver by his mid-30s, giving him a distinguished appearance that patients found reassuring. He had warm brown eyes that crinkled at the corners when he smiled, and he smiled often. He wore wire-rimmed glasses and favored conservative dark suits with crisp white shirts, the uniform of a serious professional in that era. Those who knew him described David as the kind of doctor you'd want in a crisis. He was calm under pressure, thorough in his examinations, and genuinely interested in his patients as people, not just cases. He'd often spend extra time with elderly patients, knowing that sometimes they needed someone to listen as much as they needed medication. He made house calls when necessary, even late at night, without complaint. His practice was located in a modest 3-story building on Central Avenue in downtown Albuquerque. He shared the space with another general practitioner and a dentist. The waiting room was always full. People would wait hours to see Dr. Miller, specifically trusting his judgment over that of more readily available physicians. But David wasn't all work. He had passions outside the medical field. He loved jazz music. Miles Davis and John Coltrane were constants on his office record player. He collected vintage fountain pens, a hobby that delighted his children because he let them try writing with the expensive instruments. He was teaching young Thomas to play chess, patiently explaining strategy, even when the 11-year-old made obvious mistakes. And then there was the car. In March 1960, Dr. Miller made what he called his one indulgence. He purchased a brand-new Lincoln Continental, the 1960 model with the distinctive reverse slant rear window. It was black with red leather interior, chrome accents, gleaming, a four-door sedan that cost nearly $7,000, a fortune in 1960. Helen had called it excessive, but she said it with a smile. David had worked hard. If he wanted one luxury item, she wouldn't begrudge him. David loved that car. He washed it himself every Saturday morning, despite his children's offers to help. He kept meticulous maintenance records. The Lincoln represented something to him. Success, achievement, the American dream realized. A poor kid from Chicago who'd become a doctor, driving a car that turned heads everywhere it went. In August 1961, the Miller family lived in a comfortable ranch-style home in the growing northeast heights of Albuquerque. Thomas was 11, Margaret was 9. They attended good schools. Helen was active in the local Episcopal church and volunteered with the hospital auxiliary. They took modest vacations, camping trips to Colorado, visits to Helen's parents in Texas. They were, by all accounts, happy. David's typical day followed a predictable pattern. He left home at 7:30 each morning, arriving at his office by 8 for a full day of appointments. He saw his first patient at 8:15, Mr. Robert Hayes, a regular with high blood pressure. The morning proceeded normally. Follow-up appointments, a few acute cases, one emergency walk-in with chest pain that Dr. Miller handled with his characteristic calm competence. He ate lunch at his desk as usual, a sandwich Helen had packed that morning, an apple, a thermos of coffee. He reviewed lab results while he ate, making notes in patient files. At 1 p.m., the afternoon appointments began. At 3:30, Dr. Miller saw Patricia Morrison, a young mother concerned about her infant's persistent cough. He spent 45 minutes with her, far longer than scheduled, examining the baby thoroughly and reassuring Mrs. Morrison that it was just a minor respiratory infection. He prescribed medication and told her to call if the symptoms worsened. His last scheduled appointment was at 5 o'clock. Mr. Edward Davis, 67, came in for his monthly checkup for diabetes management. Dr. Miller took his time as always. They discussed Mr. Davis's diet, adjusted his insulin dosage, and talked about Mr. Davis's grandson, who was starting college. The appointment ended at 5:30. Dorothy Garcia had already left at 5, as was her custom on Wednesdays, when Dr. Miller handled the evening closing himself. Mr. Davis later told police that Dr. Miller had walked him to the front door, locked it behind him, and waved as Mr. Davis drove away. That was 5:35. Dr. Miller was alone in the office. Now, here's where the timeline becomes crucial and where small details take on enormous significance. At 5:50, Dr. Miller called home. Helen answered. This was unusual. He typically didn't call before leaving the office. Helen would later tell investigators that David sounded normal, perhaps slightly distracted, but not upset or worried. He said he'd received a call from a ranch worker about 40 miles south who was experiencing severe abdominal pain and couldn't get to town. The man was worried it might be appendicitis. David felt obligated to check on him rather than tell the patient to wait until morning. "I should be back by 8:30, 9 at the latest," David told Helen. "Keep dinner warm for me." Those were the last words Helen Miller ever heard her husband speak. At 6:05, Martin Gonzalez, who owned the hardware store 2 doors down from Dr. Miller's office, saw the black Lincoln Continental pull out of the parking lot. He noticed because he always admired that car. He waved, but couldn't tell if Dr. Miller saw him. The Lincoln turned left onto Central Avenue, heading east toward the highway. At 6:20, Highway Patrol Officer James Rodriguez was manning a speed checkpoint on Highway 25 South, about 15 miles southeast of Albuquerque. He specifically remembered a black Lincoln Continental passing through. It wasn't speeding, doing exactly the posted limit of 65 miles per hour. Officer Rodriguez noted it because luxury cars like that were uncommon on that stretch of highway. He glanced at the driver, a man in a dark suit wearing glasses, alone in the vehicle. The description matched Dr. Miller perfectly. Highway 25 South made sense now. If David was heading to check on a ranch patient 40 miles out, this was the route he'd take. The highway led into increasingly rural territory toward small ranches and eventually nothing but desert. At 7:15, Helen Miller expected to hear her husband's car in the driveway soon. Thomas and Margaret had set the table. Dinner was ready. Meatloaf, mashed potatoes, green beans. Helen had made David's favorite chocolate cake for dessert. 8 came, no David. Helen wasn't overly worried yet. Ranch calls could take longer than expected. Maybe the patient needed to be transported to a hospital. Maybe David had stopped at a colleague's house on the way back. By 9, worry began to creep in. Helen called the office. No answer. She called St. Joseph's Hospital, thinking maybe there'd been an emergency admission. No, Dr. Miller hadn't been there. She called 2 colleagues he sometimes consulted with. Neither had seen him since morning. At 9:30, genuinely frightened now, Helen called the police. The Albuquerque Police Department took the report seriously. A respected physician, reliable family man, late coming home from a house call. This wasn't some teenager out past curfew. Detective Robert Sterling was assigned to the case immediately. By 10:30, Sterling had confirmed that Dr. Miller wasn't at any local hospital, hadn't been in any reported accidents, and hadn't contacted anyone Helen knew. His office showed no signs of disturbance. The appointment book sat open on his desk. Patient files were neatly organized. Nothing suggested anything wrong. The Lincoln Continental was the key. That distinctive car should be easy to spot. Sterling put out an alert to all units. Black 1960 Lincoln Continental 4-door, license plate NM7264. Be on the lookout. By midnight on August 23, Dr. David Miller had been missing for 6 hours. His car had been seen heading south on Highway 25 toward ranch country where he'd told his wife he was going. And then, somewhere in the vast expanse of New Mexico desert, both the man and his distinctive automobile had simply vanished. The search for Dr. David Miller began in earnest at dawn on August 24. It would become one of the most intensive missing person investigations in New Mexico history. Police immediately focused on Highway 25 South. If Officer Rodriguez had seen the Lincoln at 6:20 heading southeast and Dr. Miller never came home, something happened along that route. But Highway 25 stretched for hundreds of miles through increasingly desolate terrain, and they didn't know which specific ranch David had been heading to. Helen couldn't remember if he'd mentioned a name, and no one had called the office to report a house call request. Search teams drove every mile of highway between Albuquerque and the Texas border. They looked for skid marks, broken guardrails, any sign of an accident. They checked every ranch access road, every turnoff, every place a car might have left the pavement. They found nothing. The Lincoln Continental should have been impossible to miss. It was a large, distinctive vehicle, not something that could easily be hidden, yet it was nowhere. Detective Sterling investigated every aspect of David's life, looking for explanations. Financial records showed nothing unusual. No large withdrawals, no suspicious transactions, no debts. The practice was profitable. The Millers lived comfortably but not extravagantly. Personal life beyond reproach. Colleagues described David as ethical, dedicated, and honest. Patients loved him. Detective Sterling interviewed dozens of them. Not one had a negative word to say. No one could imagine any reason David would disappear voluntarily. Was there another woman? Sterling had to ask. Helen firmly said no, and the investigation supported her. David's schedule was accounted for. He worked, he came home. There were no suspicious phone calls, no unexplained absences. Criminal involvement? Sterling explored this, too. Had David witnessed something? Was he threatened? Did a patient hold a grudge? Again, nothing. No threats had been reported, no malpractice issues, no angry family members. The house call bothered Sterling. They contacted every rancher along Highway 25 South within a 50-mile radius. Not one admitted to calling for medical help that day. Not one had even seen the black Lincoln Continental. Either David had the wrong information about the location, or something else was going on. Days became weeks. The story made headlines across New Mexico and then nationally. "Respected physician vanishes," read the Albuquerque Journal. Time magazine ran a brief piece in their national news section. The mystery captured public imagination. The successful doctor, the luxury car, the inexplicable disappearance. Tips flooded in. None led to anywhere. Someone claimed to have seen the Lincoln in El Paso, Texas. Investigation proved it was a different car. Another sighting in Flagstaff, Arizona. Again, false. A psychic offered to help. Sterling politely declined. The Civil Air Patrol conducted aerial searches of the terrain along Highway 25 and surrounding areas. From the air, they looked for glints of metal, disturbed earth, anything unusual. They found abandoned vehicles, but none was the Lincoln Continental. They found old ranch equipment, trash dumps, natural formations that looked suspicious from above, but were innocent up close. Helen Miller held press conferences pleading for information. She appeared on local television news programs. Through tears, she asked anyone who had seen David, anyone who knew anything, to please come forward. Thomas and Margaret stood beside her, two frightened children who didn't understand why their father hadn't come home. The medical community rallied. Dr. Miller's colleagues hired private investigators. They offered a $5,000 reward for information, significant money in 1961. Still, nothing. 3 months after the disappearance, Detective Sterling sat in his office, staring at the case file. He'd followed every lead, interviewed over 200 people, coordinated searches across thousands of square miles. He had one confirmed sighting, Officer Rodriguez seeing the Lincoln at 6:20 on Highway 25 South. After that, nothing. As if the earth had opened up and swallowed the car whole. Actually, Sterling wrote in his notes, that wasn't far from the truth, but he didn't know it yet. By January 1962, the active investigation had essentially stalled. The case remained open, but with no new leads, there was nowhere else to look. Detective Sterling never fully closed the file. Even after he retired in 1979, he'd occasionally pull it out, review the evidence, hoping something would click. It never did. Helen Miller waited. For months, then years. She waited for David to walk through the door with some explanation, for the phone to ring with news, for closure of any kind. It never came. The practice was closed. Another doctor took over David's patients. The office on Central Avenue was rented to a law firm. The Lincoln Continental's registration lapsed. Insurance companies eventually paid out on David's life insurance after the required waiting period, though Helen had to have him declared legally dead first. The Miller children grew up without their father. Thomas became an engineer. Margaret became a teacher. Both married, had children of their own, but they never stopped wondering what had happened to their dad on that August evening in 1961. Albuquerque moved on as cities do. New stories replaced old ones. New mysteries emerged. But among those who remembered, the case of Dr. David Miller remained the defining unsolved mystery. The doctor who drove into the desert and never came back. The Lincoln Continental that vanished as if it had never existed. 63 years would pass. 63 years of questions without answers, of a family living in limbo, of a secret buried so deep and so well that no one thought it would ever be discovered, until a rancher needed water for his cattle, and a drill bit struck something it shouldn't have 11 feet below the surface of the New Mexico desert. The 1960s passed, and the mystery of Dr. David Miller became a story people told. It appeared in books about unsolved disappearances. True crime magazines occasionally revisited it. Local historians in Albuquerque included it in collections of New Mexico mysteries. The theories multiplied over the years, each more elaborate than the last. Some believed David had been murdered by someone connected to organized crime. In the early 1960s, certain elements of the underworld were active in New Mexico. Others thought he'd been abducted by aliens, a popular theory in the era of early UFO sightings. Some even whispered that David had staged his own disappearance, overwhelmed by the pressures of his life. But those who knew him best dismissed such ideas. David Miller was a pillar of his community, a devoted family man. Selfish abandonment was simply not in his character. Helen Miller never remarried. She raised her children alone, always maintaining a quiet dignity, always clinging to the hope that one day she would know. She died in 1998 at age 70, never knowing what had happened to her husband. Her obituary mentioned she was preceded in death by her husband, Dr. David Miller, who disappeared in 1961. Even in death, the mystery followed the family. Thomas Miller, who'd been 11 when his father disappeared, became an aerospace engineer and worked on early space shuttle projects. He named his first son David. He kept his father's medical diploma framed in his home office. When his own children asked about their grandfather, Thomas would tell them stories, the chess games, the fountain pens, the gentle patience David had shown teaching his son about the world. Margaret Miller married and became Margaret Sullivan. She taught elementary school for 35 years. She kept a photograph of her father on her desk throughout her career. Students would ask about it, and she'd explain that her father had been a doctor who'd helped many people before he disappeared. She used it as a teaching moment about cherishing time with loved ones. Both siblings pursued answers their entire lives. In 1982, they hired a private investigator to review the case with fresh eyes. He found nothing new. In 1995, they convinced the Albuquerque Police Department to re-examine the case file using modern investigative techniques. Still nothing. In 2010, they submitted their father's hairbrush and toothbrush to a DNA database in case unidentified remains ever matched. No hits ever came. The 1960 Lincoln Continental itself became legendary. Classic car enthusiasts knew the story. Collectors of automotive history included it in lists of famous missing vehicles. The car's vehicle identification number was in databases across the country. If it ever surfaced at a junkyard, a restoration shop, a vintage car show, someone would recognize it. It never surfaced. Which made sense, many reasoned, because it was probably at the bottom of a ravine somewhere, covered by 60 years of desert erosion, or buried in an old mine shaft, or rusting away in some remote canyon where no one ever went. The land where the Thompson Ranch now operated had changed hands several times since 1961. In 1961, it had been owned by the Mendoza family, cattle ranchers who'd held the property since the 1920s. They'd sold it in 1975 to a corporate agriculture company. That company sold it in 1995 to another ranch operation, which ultimately sold it to the Thompson family in 2016. None of these owners had any connection to Dr. Miller. None had any reason to know that beneath their feet, buried deeper than any normal excavation would reach, lay the answer to one of New Mexico's most enduring mysteries. By 2024, Thomas Miller was 74 years old. Margaret Sullivan was 71. Both had grandchildren. Both had lived full lives, but neither had ever stopped wondering. The not knowing had been its own kind of torture, worse in some ways than confirmed death, because hope never quite died. Maybe Dad had amnesia and was living somewhere, not knowing who he was. Maybe he'd been kidnapped and was still alive somewhere. Maybe. The rational part of their brains knew David Miller was dead, had probably been dead since August 23, 1961, but without proof, without a body, without answers, that small, irrational part kept hoping. On April 15, 2024, Thomas Miller's phone rang. The caller identified himself as Detective Marcus Johnson from the Torrance County Sheriff's Office. Thomas felt his heart drop. After 63 years, he knew instantly that they'd found something. "Mr. Miller," Detective Johnson said carefully, "we need you to sit down. We believe we found your father's car." The Thompson Ranch covers 4,000 acres of high desert grassland, about 60 miles southeast of Albuquerque, just off Highway 25 south. It's cattle country, sparse vegetation, dramatic skies, land that looks essentially the same as it did a century ago. In early April 2024, ranch owner Tom Thompson decided they needed a new water well. The old well, drilled in the 1970s, was producing less water each year. With climate change affecting the region and cattle needing reliable water sources, a new well was non-optional. Thompson hired Herrera Drilling, a local company with decades of experience in New Mexico groundwater. Carlos Herrera and his crew arrived on April 12th with their drilling rig, ready to spend a few days putting in a well that hopefully would serve the ranch for the next 50 years. They'd chosen the drilling site based on geological surveys and dowsing, a combination of science and ranching tradition. It was in the eastern section of the property, about a quarter-mile from the nearest ranch road, in an area that had been used for grazing but nothing else. The first day of drilling went normally. The rig punched through topsoil and sedimentary rock. The second day, they reached about 10 feet when Carlos noticed the drill bit seemed to be struggling, not with rock, but with something that gave resistance differently. At 11 feet, 3.3 meters, the drill bit struck something that made a metallic clang, audible even over the rig's engine. Carlos immediately stopped. In 40 years of drilling wells, he'd hit buried pipes, old farm equipment, even once a buried World War II-era ammunition box, but this felt different. This was big. Using hand tools, Carlos and Tom Thompson carefully excavated around the drill point. 3 feet from the surface, they exposed what looked like a flat metal surface. Painted metal. Black painted metal. "Tom," Carlos said slowly, "I think there's a car down here." They called the Torrance County Sheriff's Office. Deputies arrived within the hour. What they found defied belief. Buried 11 feet below the surface was a complete automobile, a large one. As they carefully removed more soil, the distinctive shape emerged: the long hood, the chrome grille, the reverse slant rear window of a 1960 Lincoln Continental. Sheriff Maria Rodriguez arrived personally. She'd grown up hearing the legend of Dr. Miller's disappearance. Her grandfather had been part of the 1961 search efforts. When deputies uncovered enough of the car to see the license plate, NM7264, Rodriguez felt chills run down her spine. Call the state police, call the FBI, and somebody find Thomas and Margaret Miller. The excavation took 3 days. It had to be done carefully, treating it as both a crime scene and an archaeological site. Heavy equipment was brought in to remove soil. Gradually, forensic teams documented every
stage. News helicopters circled overhead once word got out. What they found was both remarkable and disturbing. The Lincoln Continental was surprisingly intact. Being buried had protected it from weather and vandalism. The paint was still black, though covered in soil. The chrome was tarnished, but present. The tires had long since deteriorated. The windshield was cracked. But the car hadn't just accidentally ended up 11 feet underground. The depth alone indicated deliberate burial. 11 feet requires serious excavation equipment. Someone had dug a hole big enough for a car, driven or pushed the Lincoln into it, and covered it with over 3 meters of earth. Inside the car, forensic investigators found skeletal remains in the driver's seat. After 63 years in a sealed environment, only bones remained, along with remnants of fabric from clothing, deteriorated leather from shoes, and metal objects, a corroded belt buckle, a rusted wristwatch, and several fountain pens scattered on what remained of the floor. On April 18, 2024, Detective Marcus Johnson made the calls that would finally bring some answers to the Miller family. Thomas Miller flew in from Colorado. Margaret Sullivan drove from California. Both arrived at the Torrance County Sheriff's Office on April 19th, facing a moment they'd imagined thousands of times but never truly expected to experience. Sheriff Rodriguez showed them photographs, the car, the license plate, the skeletal remains, items recovered from inside the vehicle, a corroded medical bag with deteriorated instruments still recognizable by their shape, fountain pens that matched the collection their father had treasured. Thomas Miller, 74 years old, broke down crying. For 63 years he'd wondered. For 63 years he'd hoped for answers. Now he had some, and they were both relief and renewed grief. "It has to be him," Thomas said, his voice cracking. "Dad's finally been found." The discovery created a media sensation. National news covered it. The story had everything: decades-old mystery, a dramatic discovery, forensic investigation, a family's long wait for closure. "Missing doctor found after 63 years" read headlines across the country. But finding the car and the remains only answered one question: where was David Miller? It raised a dozen others. How did he end up buried 11 feet underground? Who buried him? Why was he already dead when the car was buried? Or was this something even more horrific? And most importantly, who knew the location all these years and said nothing? The forensic investigation into the remains found in the Lincoln Continental took months. The results, when they finally came, provided some answers but left crucial questions forever unanswered, and importantly, could not provide absolute certainty about the most fundamental question of all. Dr. Sarah Rodriguez, forensic anthropologist from the University of New Mexico, led the analysis. After 63 years in a buried, sealed environment, the remains were entirely skeletal. Soft tissues had completely decomposed. This limited what could be determined with scientific certainty. The skeleton was consistent with a male in his late 30s to early 40s, approximately 6 feet tall, matching Dr. David Miller's known physical characteristics. But this alone wasn't enough for positive identification. Dental analysis provided the strongest evidence. Dr. Miller's dental records from 1961 showed several distinct features: a gold crown on an upper molar, specific filling patterns in 3 teeth, and a slightly irregular left incisor. The skull recovered from the Lincoln showed matching features in the teeth that remained intact. However, several teeth were missing entirely, having detached from the jaw over the decades, which meant the comparison was incomplete. DNA analysis was attempted from bone marrow samples, but after 63 years of burial, genetic material was severely degraded. Mitochondrial DNA testing showed some familial markers consistent with samples provided by Thomas and Margaret, but the results were not conclusive enough for definitive identification. The DNA was too fragmented to provide the kind of certainty modern forensics usually delivers. More disturbing was evidence of skull trauma. The left temporal bone showed a depressed fracture consistent with blunt force impact. Dr. Rodriguez's report stated carefully that this type of injury could potentially have been fatal or incapacitating. But after 63 years of decomposition, it is impossible to determine whether this injury occurred ante-mortem, perimortem, or post-mortem. In plain language, was David Miller murdered with a blow to the head? Did he die in some kind of accident that fractured his skull? Or did damage occur after death, perhaps during the burial process? The bones simply couldn't answer these questions. Inside the car, investigators found metal objects that had survived burial. The fountain pens were so corroded that their original appearance was nearly unrecognizable, but X-ray analysis showed they were high-quality writing instruments, consistent with the kind Dr. Miller collected. A rusted medical bag contained stainless steel instruments whose shapes, though heavily corroded, were identifiable as medical tools from the 1950s-1960s era. Crucially, no documents survived. Paper, leather wallet materials, fabric, all had completely decomposed in the buried environment. There was no driver's license to read, no identification cards to examine, nothing with David Miller's name that survived the decades. The car itself provided additional context. The Lincoln Continental's VIN number matched the registration for the vehicle purchased by Dr. David Miller in March 1960. The license plate, NM7264, was confirmed through archived DMV records as having been issued to David Miller. The vehicle showed no evidence of collision damage. Whatever happened, the Lincoln hadn't crashed or rolled. The location was significant. The burial site was approximately 47 miles southeast of Albuquerque on what would have been a direct route along Highway 25 south, consistent with Officer Rodriguez's sighting of the car at 6:20 p.m. heading in that direction and with David's stated intention of visiting a ranch patient. Historical property research revealed critical information. In 1961, this land had been part of the Mendoza Ranch. The Mendoza family raised cattle and kept largely to themselves. The patriarch, Eduardo Mendoza, had died in 1968. His sons had sold the ranch in 1975 and moved to Texas. All known members of the 1961-era Mendoza family were now deceased. Detective Johnson's investigation uncovered some intriguing facts about the Mendozas. Eduardo owned a small excavator for digging stock tanks and maintaining ranch roads. Equipment records showed he'd purchased diesel fuel in unusually large quantities in late August 1961. A neighboring rancher remembered Eduardo mentioning he was doing some earth-moving work on the east section of his property during that time. The east section was exactly where the Lincoln Continental was found. Burying a car 11 feet deep would require exactly the kind of equipment Eduardo Mendoza owned. But why would he have done this? Investigation revealed no connection between Dr. Miller and Eduardo Mendoza. No evidence they'd ever met, no business dealings, no medical records showing Mendoza or his family as patients, no reason for conflict. Several theories emerged, but none could be proven. Theory 1. Dr. Miller was responding to a legitimate emergency call from a ranch worker. Something went wrong, an argument, an accident, an altercation. Miller died, and whoever was responsible panicked and buried the evidence. Theory 2. Miller was lured to the remote location under false pretenses, robbed, and killed. The perpetrator buried the car and body to hide the crime. Theory 3. Miller witnessed something he shouldn't have, illegal activity, a crime in progress, and was killed to ensure his silence. Theory 4. The ranch call was real, but Miller arrived at the wrong property by mistake, encountered someone dangerous, and became a victim of circumstance. Each theory had plausibility, none had proof. The Torrance County District Attorney reviewed all evidence and reached a careful conclusion based on the totality of circumstantial evidence, including the vehicle identification, the location, the timeline, the physical characteristics of the remains, and the partial dental match. We believe these remains are most likely those of Dr. David Andrew Miller. However, due to the degraded state of physical evidence after 63 years, absolute scientific certainty is not achievable. The case will remain open as a suspicious death investigation, but without living suspects or conclusive evidence, prosecution is not possible. In legal and practical terms, this meant the Miller family would have to accept likelihood rather than certainty. Thomas and Margaret discussed this reality with their own families. After 60 years of having no answers at all, having probable answers felt like enough. On September 15, 2024, a funeral was held for the remains believed to be those of Dr. David Miller. The service was held at the same Episcopal church the Miller family had attended in 1961. The remains were buried at Sunset Memorial Park in Albuquerque, next to where Helen had been laid at rest in 1998. The
The gravestone chosen by Thomas and Margaret reads,